He came back hearing sounds and followed the sound. The cries of his baby, small and tired, the kind of cry that feels like it's begging for someone's arms. And his heart sank a little deeper with every step. But nothing prepared him for what waited as he opened the nursery door, because the sight inside wasn't just shocking. It was something no father ever expects to see. The baby's cries cut through the mansion like a wound, raw, desperate, the sound of a little soul begging not to be forgotten. And in that quiet room, where grief still lived in the walls, a maid with trembling hands held him close because she knew what it felt like to lose a child. Her heart thundered. Her body remembers. And when she lifts him to her chest, choosing instinct over rules, peace finally washes over his fragile breath. But the door swings open. His father freezes, a millionaire staring at the sight no man expects to see. And in that one heartbeat, everything breaks and everything begins. Jason had been screaming for hours, his face flushed, his body trembling with exhaustion, abandoned once again by the nanny who vanished with excuses about buying formula. Every wall of the mansion had echoed with his need, a sound sharp enough to reopen every wound inside Maria's heart. 8 weeks ago, she buried her own child. Every cry from Jason had dragged her back to that night. The panic, the helplessness, the hollow dread of losing a heartbeat you would give anything to save. Her body, still producing milk despite her loss, had become a painful reminder of everything missing from her life. And today, it became the reason she acted. When Maria found Jason limp in his crib, fever burning through his tiny body, the spoiled bottle lying forgotten beside him, something inside her shattered. Instinct moved faster than fear, faster than reason, faster than the rules separating a maid from the son of a millionaire. Now, in her arms, Jason finally rests. His fingers curl against her skin. His breathing softens. Peace settles over him like a fragile blessing. The door creaks open. Edward Wallace stands framed in the light of the hallway, tall, immaculate in a navy suit, shoulders squared as if bracing his entire world alone. His grief has carved deep, invisible hollow places in him. But in this moment his face shows only shock. Shock at the sight of his maid nursing his child. His eyes flicker between them. Maria's trembling form, Jason's contented sleep, the intimacy of a moment that should never have existed. Confusion, anger, gratitude, and raw pain war inside his expression as the silence thickens around them. Maria's breath catches. She clutches Jason protectively, unsure if she has just saved a life or ruined her own. Edward's voice is low, tight. "Maria, what are you doing?" His question hangs between them, heavy enough to break whatever peace the room pretends to hold. Outside the window, clouds gather. A storm waits. And this moment, quiet, fragile, forbidden, is only the beginning. Because to understand the explosion this moment will ignite, we must go back to the loneliness, grief, and mistakes that led them here. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that love and true connection can come in the most unexpected ways. Edward Hale wasn't always the stiff, hollow-eyed man who stood in that doorway like a ghost. There was a time, long before his heart calcified, when he laughed easily, kissed his wife's forehead every morning, and believed life could be controlled with logic, structure, and wealth. That belief shattered the day she died. The world remembers him as the quiet millionaire with the tragic past, but grief had turned Edward into something more complicated than any rumor could capture. He lost more than a wife. He lost the part of himself capable of softness. Jason came into the world in a storm. Cold rain, flashing lights, frantic nurses pushing a bed down a hospital corridor. His wife, Elena, was pale, sweating, whispering his name. Edward held her hand until the nurse gently pulled him back. Complications. Too much blood. Too little time. When the doctor finally emerged, removing his gloves with a slow, mournful movement, Edward already knew. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Everything muffled except for one sentence that would live forever inside him. "We saved the baby. We couldn't save her. He never cried there in the hall, not once. Instead, he walked to the nursery window and stared at the newborn boy who had taken everything from him. He whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to be your father." And for months after that, he kept that promise, not knowing, not trying, barely looking at the child who represented both love and loss. People imagine wealth comes with freedom, comfort, admiration. But Edward learned that grief makes money useless. All it did was build thicker walls. Neighbors whispered when he drove away each morning before his son woke up. "There he goes again. He can't even hold his own child. Poor baby barely knows his father." Edward heard it all. He pretended he didn't. His home, once warm and full of music, became a museum of silence. Employees lowered their voices when he walked by. When he entered a room, conversations died like candles in the wind. And little Jason cried whenever Edward even picked him up. Babies sense things. They feel the emotional vacancy adults think they hide well. Edward convinced himself work was the responsible thing, the smart thing, the only thing keeping him from collapsing. So he buried himself in contracts, boardrooms, investments, anything that didn't breathe or tug at his heart. Anything that wasn't his son. 6 weeks after Elena died, Edward hired a nanny recommended by a wealthy acquaintance. Grace seemed professional, polished, experienced. She smiled too much, but Edward was too numb to care. Grace was patient in front of him, gentle with Jason when watched, but indifferent when she thought no one was looking. Jason's bottles were often cold. His diapers are sometimes unchanged. She left him crying a little too long, sleeping a little too often. The staff whispered concerns. Edward shut them down. He didn't want another decision on his conscience. Didn't want to admit he might have chosen wrong again. So Jason lived his tiny life in quiet neglect, longing for warmth he couldn't name, comfort he had never fully felt. Until Maria walked into the Hale mansion for the very first time. Maria Hernandez had once been sunlight personified, a girl who laughed with her whole body and loved without caution. Life wasn't easy, but she never complained. She was raised in a small, humble home where neighbors shared food, mothers shared burdens, and children played in dusty streets under a forgiving sky. But grief finds even the brightest hearts. 8 weeks before she stepped into Edward's world, Maria lost her infant son. She still remembers the way the doctor's voice wavered, the way the room grew cold, the way her own breath refused to return after the first scream left her chest. Her baby had been alive that morning, and gone by nightfall. Her arms felt permanently empty. Her soul felt permanently unfinished. Her body, stubborn, clinging to memory, still produced milk. Every morning, when she woke, it was a fresh reminder that her child was gone. She applied for jobs, not because she was ready to work again, but because the landlord had slipped a final warning under her door. Grief did not pause rent. Tears did not buy groceries. So she became a housemaid. Not because she wanted to, but because life forced her to survive. 2 people living in the same city, breathing the same air, yet worlds apart. Edward, surrounded by wealth, but emotionally starving. Maria, surrounded by poverty, but overflowing with love she had no one to give. Both had empty places inside them, places shaped like the people they lost. And fate, quiet, patient, purposeful, began weaving their stories together long before either of them realized it. Maria arrived at the Hale estate on a gray morning. The sky hung low, swollen with rain. Her shoes were worn, her uniform freshly ironed but faded. She clutched the strap of her bag tightly as the gates opened. Inside, wealth towered over her like a cathedral. Marble floors, high ceilings, walls that whispered old money. Maria felt small, but she felt something else too. A cry, not a normal cry, a desperate one, a baby's plea echoing through long hallways. Grace, the nanny, looked annoyed, bouncing Jason half-heartedly and sighing loudly. "He's always like this," Grace muttered. "Some babies are just needy. You'll get used to it." But Maria didn't hear the words. She heard the pain. Her arms tingled. Her heart contracted. Instinct overwhelmed grief. Jason's tiny face was blotchy with tears, his breathing quick. Something inside Maria cracked open. Grace shoved the bottle into his mouth. Jason pushed it away, sobbing harder. "He doesn't like milk when it's cold," Maria whispered. Grace scoffed. "Milk is milk. He'll drink when he gets tired." And she walked off. Maria stood frozen in place, torn between rules and instinct. Jason's cry changed, from frustrated to panicked, to heartbreak. The same sound her own son made on his final night. Her vision blurred. Her breath trembled. And she knew. She couldn't walk away from this child. She picked him up, held him close, rocking him gently. His small fist grabbed the collar of her uniform. His cheek pressed against her chest. He was hungry, desperate, seeking warmth he had lived without. Maria fought her tears. "I'm here, little one. I'm here," she whispered, though her voice cracked with grief that had never truly healed. In that moment, her motherhood, buried under 8 weeks of agony, rose again like a flame. And fate, watching silently, took note. From that day forward, Jason began crying whenever Maria left the room. He rejected Grace's cold bottle, Grace's forced smile, Grace's impatience. But the moment Maria touched him, he quieted. He breathed normally. He clung to her like she was safety itself. The staff noticed. Grace noticed too, and jealousy took root. But Edward did not notice. He was too busy running from a child who represented a wound he didn't want to reopen. Little did he know that the one person who could heal that wound had already walked into his home. Soft-footed, gentle-hearted, carrying more grief than he could imagine. Edward's loneliness sat heavy on his chest every night as he returned home to a quiet house, a cold dinner, and a child sleeping in darkness. Maria's loneliness sat heavy in her bones as she cleaned rooms filled with family portraits from a life she never lived. 2 different worlds, 2 different losses, yet the same hollow ache inside them. And Jason, the tiny bridge between those worlds, felt her warmth long before Edward saw it. He cried for Maria throughout the day. He searched for her with frantic little eyes. He reached for her whenever she walked by. Babies know love. Babies know safety. Babies know who their heart belongs to. And Jason, bereft of his mother's touch, chose Maria. The consequences of that choice would change everything. For him, for her, for the man standing shell-shocked in the doorway. And this was only the beginning. Jealousy doesn't shout. It whispers, soft, poisonous, patient. Grace had watched the shift in the house for days. Jason reached for Maria now, not her. His tiny hands grasped for the warmth she never truly offered him. And Edward? He didn't notice the full details, but he noticed something, and that alone was enough to ignite her insecurity. Grace had worked for the Hale household long before Maria arrived. She considered herself untouchable, part of the furniture, part of the system, part of Edward's carefully controlled world. Then came Maria, the quiet girl with sad eyes and natural gentleness. The girl Jason clung to like a lifeline. The girl who made Grace feel replaceable. It didn't take long for jealousy to find its voice. Grace started small. "She's always holding him," she told the cook one morning, shaking her head dramatically. "It's not healthy. Babies get attached too quickly." The cook frowned. "He's attached because she's gentle." Grace forced a laugh. "Gentle? Oh, please. She wants attention. Didn't you see how she breastfed him that day?" As if she wanted to make some big emotional scene, right when Mr. Hale walked in. 2 maids exchanged glances. Grace lowered her voice. "I've worked in big houses long enough to know when a maid is trying to rise above her place. Rumors in wealthy homes do not walk. They fly." Servants whispered. Drivers repeated what they'd overheard. Gardner nodded along, not sure what was true anymore. And by afternoon, even the neighbors, always hungry for gossip, had caught the scent. Edward rarely spoke to neighbors. They always treated him strangely, some with pity, some with curiosity, some with that fake sympathy reserved for the wealthy who suffer tragedy. But that day, when he stepped out to his car, 2 women from across the street pretended not to stare as he passed. Pretended, but failed miserably. One whispered, loudly enough for him to hear, "Did you hear? That new maid. feeding the baby like she's the mother? Completely inappropriate. The other replied, I told you. Ever since his wife died, the house has lost structure. It's dangerous to let staff cross boundaries. His jaw tightened. Dangerous? Boundaries? Inappropriate? He froze mid-step. Another voice, an older man leaning on his mailbox, added, These young maids come with agendas, especially when the boss has money. Trust me, I've seen this before. Edward said nothing, but he felt the sting of humiliation like a slap. The familiar fear of being judged. The familiar pressure of protecting his reputation. The Hale name, the last thing he could control since losing Elena. Logic whispered inside him, Maria isn't like that. But pride shouted louder. This could become a scandal. Fear of whispers. Fear of headlines. Fear of losing control again. Fear can make a man believe anything. Maria didn't know any of this. She spent the morning quietly cleaning Jason's nursery, humming softly as he giggled in her arms. When the intercom buzzed, she jumped. Maria, Edward's voice said, smooth but cold. Come to my office. Now. She swallowed. Her heartbeat stuttered. His tone felt wrong. Sharp, distant, nothing like the rare soft-spoken man she had glimpsed when he held Jason. She knocked gently. Come in. Edward sat behind his massive mahogany desk, legs crossed, hands folded, face unreadable. The blinds were half-drawn, slicing lines of shadow across his suit. Sir, you asked for me? He didn't look up at her immediately, and that alone sent a quiet chill through her body. Finally, he said, There have been concerns. Concerns? She whispered. About your behavior with my son. Her breath caught. My behavior? Cold silence. I was told about the incident. You breastfeeding him. His jaw clenched. In my home. Without permission. And in a way that drew unnecessary attention. Maria's body stiffened as if struck. Sir, he was crying, and you made a choice that was not yours to make. I didn't do it for attention, she breathed. Jason was hungry. The bottle was cold. The nanny. This is not about Grace, he snapped. For the first time in 8 weeks, Maria's voice broke. Please, sir. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I wasn't trying to be anything except helpful. Edward stood up abruptly, palms pressed on the desk. You crossed a boundary, and now people are talking. Maria felt the floor tilt beneath her. I didn't mean to cause trouble, but you did. His voice was steel. Final. Closed. You're dismissed, he said. Collect your things. Her breath shattered. Her hands trembled. Please, she whispered. He needs me. Jason needs. Enough. His voice turned cruel to hide his fear. You will leave by the end of the hour. Her lips parted in disbelief. You're firing me? Effective immediately. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. I lost my child 2 months ago, she whispered broken. Caring for Jason, it helped me breathe again. Edward froze, just for a second, the tiniest flicker of guilt in his eyes. But pride extinguished it instantly. This decision is final. Maria pressed both hands over her mouth to stop the sob that rose like a wave. Then, head bowed, shoulders trembling, she turned and walked out. The sound of her footsteps in the hallway was small. Too small for a house so large. Too small for the heartbreak she carried. But Edward didn't follow. Didn't call her back. He stood in his cold office, convincing himself he had done the right thing. He had no idea the damage he'd just done. Maria walked down the hall toward the staff quarters to gather her things. She tried to be silent. She tried to be strong. She failed at both. But someone heard. Jason. The moment he caught sight of her through the nursery doorway, bag in hand, eyes wet, he let out a scream that split the house open. Not a cry, not a whimper, a scream. He reached for her with shaking hands, face red, tears streaming. Maria rushed to him instinctively, but Grace blocked the way. No, Grace said smugly. You're done here. Jason screamed louder, choking on sobs. Maria's lips trembled. Please, let me hold him one last time. Grace smirked. Not your baby. Maria choked on a sob as Grace lifted Jason away. He kicked, thrashed, fought like a child whose entire world was being torn from him. Maria, he wailed, voice cracking. Ma, ja. It wasn't a real word, just a sound. but it was his first attempt at one, and he cried for her. Grace carried him out of sight. His screams echoed down the corridor, raw and desperate. Maria pressed a hand to her heart, feeling it tear open. "He thinks I'm leaving him too," she whispered. "Another child I'm losing." Her legs trembled as she forced herself toward the exit doors. Every step away from Jason felt like walking with broken bones. Behind her, Jason's cries grew weaker, his voice hoarse. He clawed at Grace's uniform, reaching toward the doorway where Maria had disappeared. Then came his strangest, quietest moment. He stopped. He didn't tire. He didn't calm. He broke. His tiny body went limp. His face is buried in Grace's shoulder. Silent tears soaked her dress. Grace frowned. "What's wrong with you?" she muttered. Jason didn't respond. He refused the bottle she shoved toward his mouth. He turned his face away from food, from her, from everything. The housekeeper rushed over. "Why is he shaking?" "How should I know?" Grace snapped. "He's not breathing right," the housekeeper whispered. "He's panicking. Where is Maria? We should call." "No, gracias." She was fired, and he'll get over it. But he didn't get over it. Not by evening. Not by nightfall. Not by the next morning. Jason refused every bottle, every spoon, every attempt at comfort. He cried himself into exhaustion, and then cried again, and again, and again, his little heart calling for the woman Edward had driven away, his tiny soul searching for the only warmth he had known since the day he entered the world. The simple lie Grace planted had grown into a storm, and Edward, the man who thought he was protecting his reputation, had no idea that he had just broken the one bond that could have saved all of them. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as silence. That's how the trouble began. The first night after Maria's firing, the Hale mansion felt colder than usual, an emptiness hanging in the air like fog. Jason cried himself hoarse until his tiny voice cracked into painful whimpers. The entire staff heard him, but no one dared question Edward's decision. Grace, annoyed and tired, tried rocking him, feeding him, humming songs. Nothing worked. Jason's small face was swollen with tears, his eyelids heavy but restless. He kept stretching his arms toward the door, as if expecting Maria to appear, as if waiting for the only person who understood him. Grace muttered under her breath, "You'll forget her soon enough." But Jason didn't forget. He refused. The next morning, the bottle remained untouched. Not a single drop missing. Grace tried again. "Come on," she coaxed, forcing the nipple near his lips. "Just drink." Jason pressed his lips tight, turning his head away. His eyes were blank, lifeless, hollow. By noon, he hadn't eaten anything. His little stomach growled painfully, but grief overpowered hunger. By evening, the crying stopped, not because he was calm, but because he no longer had the strength to cry. And that terrified Grace. "Hush now," she said nervously, shaking the bottle. "You need a drink." Jason didn't move, didn't blink, didn't respond. He just lay there, his breathing shallow, face pale, eyes glazed. And for the first time, Grace felt real fear. Edward came home late, exhausted and irritable. He removed his tie, barely paying attention to Grace when she approached him in the hallway. "Sir, Jason hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." Edward froze. "What?" "He's being difficult," she said quickly. "Very fussy." Edward went to the nursery. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. Jason lay weakly on his side, cheeks flushed bright red, sweat dampening his hairline. His breaths were uneven, little gasps as if the air hurt. "Jason," Edward whispered, touching his forehead. It burned under his palm. "Grace!" Edward barked. She jumped. "Sir, I think he's just teething." "This is a fever," Edward snapped. "Why wasn't I told earlier?" Grace swallowed hard. "I didn't want to worry you. He gets sick sometimes." But Edward wasn't listening. Panic rose like a wave, tightening his chest. He lifted his son, holding him close for the first time without hesitation. Jason didn't react, didn't smile, didn't even reach for him. A terrifying stillness. Edward hurried downstairs, shouting, "Prepare the car." The staff scrambled. Grace stood frozen, trembling. Her mistakes had begun to unravel, and she knew it. At the hospital, bright lights and sterile air swallowed them. Nurses rushed Jason into a warm bed, placing tiny monitors on his chest. Edward hovered helplessly, pacing like a man whose world was falling apart. A doctor approached after examining Jason. "His vitals are unstable," she said calmly. "He's severely dehydrated." Edward blinked. How is that possible? He had a nanny. He had bottles. The doctor hesitated. "He appears malnourished. His stomach shows the signs of inconsistent feeding." Malnourished. The word cracked something inside Edward's chest. "We need to run neurological tests," the doctor continued. But what?" Edward demanded. The doctor sighed. "We suspect this decline may be emotional." Edward stared at her. Emotional? He's a baby. Babies feel loss more deeply than we realize. Sudden separation from a primary comfort source can cause physical shutdown, refusing food, crying till exhaustion, stress fevers. She paused. Did anything change in his environment recently? Edward's throat tightened. Yes, something had changed. Someone. But he forced himself to say nothing. His own pride wouldn't let the truth pass through his lips. Meanwhile, Grace was spiraling. The moment Edward left the house with Jason, she began covering her tracks with frantic energy. She tore through the nursery, throwing away old bottles, wiping surfaces, hiding evidence. The watered-down formula, cheap brand she bought secretly to pocket extra money, dumped. The spoiled bottle she'd left out for too long, rinsed and bleached. The nanny camera she had unplugged to avoid scrutiny, reconnected, as if it had never been touched. She wiped sweat from her forehead, whispering to herself, "This isn't my fault. Babies get sick. Babies cry. This isn't my fault." But deep inside, she knew. She watered down his formula every day, ignored his cries, left him strapped in the crib longer than she should. And worst of all, she had driven away the only person Jason trusted. As she cleaned, a horrifying thought gripped her chest. What if he doesn't survive this? And if he didn't, everything would fall on her. At the hospital, hours passed. Jason was hooked 2 and 4. Clear liquid dripped slowly into his tiny arm. His eyelids fluttered weakly, but he didn't fully wake. Edward sat beside him, shoulders drooping, hands trembling violently. This was the first time he truly looked at his son. The tiny fingers, the soft cheeks, the fragile breaths, the resemblance to Elena. A memory stabbed him. Elena holding her belly, laughing, saying, "He will need you, Edward. Promise me you'll be a good father." He had broken that promise before the boy ever opened his eyes. The doctor approached again. "We've ruled out neurological damage," she said gently. "There's no infection, no disease." Edward swallowed. "Then what's wrong?" "This is a child in emotional distress. Severe distress." He squeezed his eyes shut. The doctor continued softly. "He is suffering from an abrupt emotional loss." And that was the moment Edward's mask of control finally cracked. He buried his face in his hands, shaking. He had fired the one woman who gave Jason warmth. He had believed lies over instinct. He had let pride make decisions love should have made. He whispered to no one, "What have I done?" Jason stayed in the hospital overnight. Then 2 nights. Then 3. Doctors monitored his dehydration, his nutrition levels, his fever spikes. But nothing worked quickly because the root cause wasn't medical. It was emotional. And every hour that passed, Edward's guilt grew heavier. He brought toys. Jason ignored them. He tried to hold him. Jason didn't react. He whispered apologies. Jason slept through them. Every day, the nurses asked the same question. Has his primary caregiver been contacted? Edward always answered quietly, "There is no one." But the nurses exchanged doubtful looks because Jason behaved like a child, missing someone specific, someone whose presence mattered more than food or rest. And Edward realized something painfully clear. He never saw Jason light up for anyone, except Maria. The truth landed in his chest like a stone. Grace's version of events had never made sense. Maria's tears had been real. Jason's screams had been desperate. And the whispering neighbors, the lies, the humiliation, he had let all of it blind him. Now his son might pay the ultimate price for his mistakes. Near midnight on the 4th night, Jason's fever spiked suddenly. Alarms beeped. Nurses ran in. Edward stood frozen in the corner as the medical team worked around the fragile, motionless child. A nurse called out, "He's severely stressed. Comfort is not working." Another nurse whispered urgently, "We need the person he's emotionally bonded to." Edward felt his heart stop. He whispered, almost choking, "He doesn't have anyone. I fired her." The nurses stared at him in disbelief. "You fired the person your baby bonded with?" one asked quietly. Edward swallowed painfully, nodding. The nurse took a slow breath and said, "Then you need to bring her back. Now, or this baby will keep shutting down." The words hit Edward like a blow. He didn't wait another second. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and whispered to his unconscious son, "I'm going to find her, Jason. I'm bringing her back. I swear it." Because for the first time since Elena died, Edward realized he was about to lose something again. And this time, he had the power to stop it. Edward hadn't slept more than an hour when his head of security called. "Sir, you need to come downstairs. Now." Something in the man's voice, tight, uneasy, sent a chill through Edward's spine. He left Jason's hospital room, the beeping machines echoing behind him, and took the elevator down. When the doors opened, two guards stood waiting, their expressions carved with tension. "We went through the house cameras," the chief said, holding a tablet out. "You told us to review the footage from the last week. Sir, you need to see this." Edward took the tablet. He pressed play, and his entire world stilled. There on the screen was the nanny, Elise, closing Jason's nursery door behind her and walking away. Not for minutes, for hours. He skimmed forward with trembling fingers. The footage showed her slipping jewelry into her purse, taking envelopes from his study, texting, laughing, swinging her bag as she headed out, leaving the house entirely. Timestamp, 2:14 p.m. to 6:46 p.m., 4.5 hours. Jason had been alone in that room, hungry, crying, terrified, while she was at the mall buying makeup, shoes, and bags. Edward felt something inside him rupture. Another clip, Elise holding a formula container, except it wasn't any of the ones the hospital nutritionist had approved. This one was cheap, off-brand, and expired. He watched in stunned silence as she mixed it carelessly, then filled the bottle halfway with water to stretch it. Edward's jaw locked. Then came the final blow. She was on a call, laughing, complaining. "I swear the baby is so needy. Ever since that Maria woman left, he's been a nightmare. Ugh, I wish he'd just sleep all day." Edward stopped breathing. Maria. Her name hit him like a punch to the chest. His hands shook as he lowered the tablet, a dark storm roaring in his veins. "Where is she?" he said, voice low enough to make both guards stiffen. "We have her in the front sitting room," the chief answered. "She arrived 10 minutes ago. Said she was coming to pack her things." She claimed she didn't know Jason was hospitalized. Edward's teeth clenched. Elisa's lies. He didn't even know where to begin tearing them apart. He walked toward the sitting room with long, powerful strides. The moment he opened the door, Elise jumped to her feet. "Edward," she gasped, wringing her hands dramatically. I heard the baby isn't well. I was going to visit him, but the security wouldn't let me." "Stop talking." His voice was sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. Elise froze. Edward stepped closer, his expression unreadable, the tablet in his hand like a piece of burning coal. "Look at this." He pressed play. Elise's face drained of color. "And no, Edward, wait, this is taken out of context." She had protected Jason. She had loved the baby more genuinely than anyone else in that house. And he had pushed her away. He had believed the wrong person. He had failed the only two souls who depended on him. His guilt was a crushing weight. He grabbed his coat and keys. "I'm finding her," he muttered to himself, storming out of the mansion. He called her phone, straight to voicemail. He called again, still off. He dialed the number security had on file from her employment record. Nothing. Panic flickered through his chest. He drove to her apartment building, an old, narrow block with peeling paint and cracked steps. He climbed quickly, heart pounding, and reached her door. He knocked. No answer. He knocked harder. Still nothing. Finally, he tried the knob. Locked. The hallway was quiet, empty. A dog barked from a nearby apartment. A child's cartoon played faintly through the wall. But Maria's space was completely still. He knocked one more time, softer this time. "Maria, please." Silence. He leaned his forehead against the door, breath trembling. Only now did he see the details he had ignored before. The worn welcome mat, the faint cracks in the frame, the peeling paint around the number. It was humble. Too humble for someone who had cared for his son with such devotion. He pictured her crying as Elise accused her. He pictured her standing alone at the bus station, her uniform still stained from Jason's tears. He pictured her walking into an empty apartment, carrying heartbreak she didn't deserve. "Where are you?" he whispered. He pulled back, chest tight, and stared down at the dim corridor. She was gone, and every second she was unreachable felt like a tightening wire around his lungs. Jason needed her. He needed her more than doctors, more than medicine. Edward knew it now with unshakable clarity. Maria had been the heartbeat of the house, the one who sensed Jason's needs without being told, the one who soothed him, loved him, protected him. And he had let her walk away. No, he had pushed her away. A hard breath escaped him, thick with regret. "I will find you," he vowed quietly, gripping the railing as he descended the stairs. "Whatever it takes." Because for the first time, Edward Harrington, man of steel, man of control, man who never faltered, felt something he had never admitted to anyone. He needed her, too, and he couldn't go home until he found her. Rain hammered against the windshield as Edward drove through the city for the second hour, his fingers clenched tightly around the steering wheel. The storm blurred the streets, turning lights into streaks, shadows into ghosts. He had checked every bus stop, every cheap motel, every open shelter. Nothing. Maria was nowhere. He kept replaying the footage in his mind. Elise's cruelty, Maria's pain. He heard her trembling voice the day she had been dismissed. "Sir, I didn't do it. Please believe me." He hadn't, and now she was missing. His chest tightened painfully. Jason was still in the hospital, fighting weakness and dehydration. The thought of returning home without her, without answers, only made the ache worse. Finally, as he turned beneath an overpass near the river, his headlights caught something on the concrete walkway. A shape. Small. Still. Alone. At first, he thought it was just another bundle of blankets abandoned by the homeless. But then the shape moved, and the breath punched out of him. Maria. She was curled beside a concrete pillar, clothes soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her arms wrapped around her stomach. The rainwater had pooled around her, and each cough shook her entire body. She looked impossibly small and heartbreakingly fragile. "Maria!" he shouted, slamming his door open and running toward her. She didn't lift her head. She didn't even seem to hear him. He dropped to his knees in front of her. "Maria, Maria, look at me." Slowly, painfully, she raised her gaze. Her eyes were glazed with fever, her lips pale. When she blinked, tears mixed with the rain. "Mr. Harrington," she whispered, barely audible. Hearing his own name from her mouth like that, with so much confusion, so much hurt, made his chest crack open. "Oh God," he breathed. "Maria, what happened? What are you doing out here?" She tried to sit up straighter, but her body gave out, pitching forward. He caught her immediately, hands shaking as he held her upright. I lost my room," she murmured, voice thin and broken. "When I got fired, I couldn't pay rent. They told me to leave. I tried to find work, but nobody wanted someone who," her lips trembled, "who was accused of hurting a child." Edward shut his eyes, pain rippling through him. "You didn't hurt him," he whispered fiercely. "Maria, we didn't hurt him. I know that now." A faint cough racked her chest. She leaned into him, barely conscious. "I had nowhere else to go," she whispered. "I've been here for 2 days. 2 days. In the cold. In the rain. Sick. Alone. Because of him." Edward lifted her face gently. Her skin was burning hot. "Maria," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry." A tear slipped down her cheek, mingling with the rain. "You believed her," she said softly, not accusing, just stating the truth that had broken her. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it." He cupped her face in his palms. I was wrong. I was blind. I failed you, and I fail my son. But I'm not leaving you here. Not another second. She shivered violently, her breath hitching. Words trembled on her lips, but no sound came. She was too weak even to respond. Edward didn't wait another heartbeat. He slid his arms beneath her and lifted her against his chest. Her head fell onto his shoulder, her fingers instinctively curling into his coat, as though even in weakness, her body recognized safety at last. "You're safe," he murmured, voice shaking with emotion as he held her. "I swear to you, Maria, you're safe now. I've got you." She didn't answer. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Edward carried her through the rain, each step heavy with guilt, remorse, and desperate fear. Never in his life had he felt so powerless, so painfully human. He reached his car and opened the back door with one hand, keeping her close with the other. He laid her carefully across the seat, tucking his coat around her body to keep her warm. Her eyelids fluttered, barely staying open. "Edward," she whispered so quietly he almost didn't hear it. It was the first time she had ever said his name. He swallowed hard. "I'm here." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to say more, but her strength gave out. Her eyes closed. Panic surged through him. "No, stay with me," he pleaded, brushing wet strands of hair from her forehead. "Maria, please, don't close your eyes. We're going to the hospital. Just stay awake a little longer." But she didn't respond. Her breathing continued, faint but present. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to focus. He climbed into the driver's seat and drove faster than he ever had in his life, glancing at her every few seconds. Her face was pale, her hands limp, her body soaked and trembling. And all he could think was, "This is my fault. I put her here. I believed a lie and destroyed her life." When he screeched into the hospital entrance, nurses rushed out immediately. "She's hypothermic," one said. "She's dehydrated," another added. "Get her inside now." Edward stood frozen as they lifted her onto a stretcher, his heart lodged somewhere in his throat. The world around him blurred. The noise, the lights, the shouting instructions. Only one thing mattered. Maria. As they pushed her through the automatic doors, a nurse turned back. "Sir, you need to wait outside." He nodded numbly, but inside he was collapsing. He had built empires. He had built walls around himself. He had lived a life where he answered to no one. But tonight, he was just a man kneeling beside a hospital hallway, drenched in rain, hands shaking from the memory of a woman he carried out of the cold. A woman he had wronged. A woman he desperately needed forgiveness from. For the first time in his life, Edward Harrington prayed, "Please let her be okay." His voice cracked. "I'll fix everything. I swear it. Just don't take her away." A moment later, a doctor rushed into Jason's room down the hall, but Edward didn't move. The door that had closed behind Maria remained shut, and he remained there, waiting, broken, remorseful, and terrified, for the woman who had saved his son, and who he had nearly lost forever. Maria floated into consciousness slowly, as though pulling herself up from deep water. The first thing she felt was warmth, soft blankets tucked around her, the steady hum of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic. A hospital. Her eyelids fluttered open. The world swam into view. White lights, a curtain pulled halfway, and 4-line taped to her arm. Then, Edward, sitting beside her bed. His usually perfect hair was damp and messy, his shirt wrinkled from hours in the same position. But what startled her most wasn't the exhaustion carved into his features. It was the fear, raw, unmasked, the fear of a man who had almost lost someone and realized, far too late, how much she mattered. When their eyes met, he exhaled shakily, as though he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Maria," he whispered, voice thick. "Thank God you're awake." She blinked, confused, her throat dry. "Jason," she croaked. Something shattered inside him. He leaned forward, elbows digging into his knees, fingers trembling as he covered his face for a moment, collecting himself, fighting tears. Then he lifted his head. "Maria," he said again, voice breaking. "Jason, he's not doing well." The room tilted. She tried to sit up, panic jolting through her veins, but Edward gently pressed a hand near her shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. "He's alive," he said quickly, "but he's fading again. The doctors don't understand why. They said it might be emotional withdrawal." Her heart cracked clean down the middle. "Jason. Jason." She swallowed, forcing the words out. "I need to see him. Please." Edward exhaled a shuddering breath, wiping under his eyes with the back of his hand. I know, Maria. That's why," his voice caught. "That's why I'm here." He stood slowly, as though carrying years of guilt in his spine, and stepped closer to her bed. When he spoke again, his voice was no longer strong or stern or controlled. It was pleading. "He needs you," he whispered, "more than he needs anyone else. Please come to him." Maria couldn't breathe. He wasn't commanding her. He wasn't accusing her. He wasn't questioning her. He was asking, begging, from a place of desperation and humility she never imagined he possessed. She nodded weakly, and Edward, this powerful, intimidating man, exhaled with visible relief, like those two words had just pulled him from drowning. The walk to Jason's room was slow. Maria's legs trembled beneath her. Edward stayed close, but did not touch her unless she swayed. Every step was filled with tension, fear, and something else, something thick and unspoken between them. The door at the end of the hall stood open. Inside, monitors beeped softly. Nurses whispered with worried eyes. Jason's small body lay curled in the hospital crib, tiny chest rising faintly, far too faintly. Maria stopped in the doorway. Her heart broke. His cheeks had lost their baby rosy glow. His eyes were closed. His little fists lay limp at his sides. A low, aching sound escaped her. Edward watched her, silent, waiting, because he could see the truth written across her face. She loved the child he had feared to love, and he had torn her away. "Go to him," Edward whispered. Maria stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, Jason stirred. It was faint, barely noticeable, but Edward gasped softly beside her. His tiny fingers twitched. Maria reached the crib, tears streaming now, unstoppable. She leaned over him, her trembling hand brushing his cheek. At her touch, Jason's eyes fluttered open. A weak, desperate whimper came from his throat. Edward made a choking sound behind her. Maria gathered the baby into her arms, lifting him gently against her chest. Jason let out a thin cry, nuzzling against her as though finding something he had been searching for in the dark. His breathing eased. His small hand gripped her shirt. His face pressed in her like he was home. And then, the monitors spiked upward. His heart rate steadied. His oxygen levels rose. His tiny body warmed against hers. A nurse gasped. Another covered her mouth. "What on earth?" one whispered. The doctor rushed in. He froze. Vital signs normalizing. Fever dropping. Pulse strengthening. All within seconds. "What is happening?" Edward asked hoarsely. The doctor looked at Maria, really looked, and his expression softened with something like awe. "This," he said slowly, "is a maternal bond healing response. Infants sometimes decline when the person they've emotionally imprinted on disappears." Edward swallowed hard. He imprinted on her. The doctor nodded. Deeply, Maria lowered her head, tears falling into Jason's soft hair. His tiny fingers clung to her with surprising strength, as though afraid she might vanish again. Edward's breath hitched. He took a step forward, and another. Maria looked up at him, her eyes full of pain, fear, and something else she didn't dare name. Edward stopped beside her. His face crumpled, truly crumpled. For the first time since his wife died, since his world had shattered at the delivery room table, Edward Harrington cried, not silently, not with quiet dignity. His shoulders shook. His breath broke. Tears streamed without restraint, as though watching his son return to life had cracked open every wound he had buried for years. Maria shifted Jason slightly and extended her free hand. Edward stared at it. Then, with a shuddering exhale, he reached out and took it. Her fingers closed around his. It felt like forgiveness, like breath returning to lungs that had been starved. like life beginning again in a room that smelled of antiseptic and miracles. They held each other, broken man, broken mother, with the baby who bound them together surviving in her arms. Jason sighed sleepily, nestling closer. Maria kissed the top of his head. Edward leaned his forehead against hers, tears falling on her hand, his voice a shattered whisper. "Thank you for saving him, for coming back, for not giving up on us." Maria closed her eyes. For the first time in many months, the world didn't feel so unbearably dark. Jason was safe. Edward was human, and her touch had brought life back to the child who had become the center of all their grief. The storm outside had finally passed, but inside Edward's mansion, in the hospital room where Jason slept peacefully, the aftershocks still trembled beneath every breath. For the first time in weeks, the baby's chest rose with steady rhythm. His skin had regained color. His tiny fingers curled around Maria's blouse with quiet trust. Edward watched them from the doorway, arms folded loosely, not in authority, but in reflection. Every so often, his gaze drifted to Maria's face, searching for signs of exhaustion or pain. He owed her more than words could ever repay. He owed her his son's life. But the world outside did not know the truth yet, not the real truth. It began with whispers. A nurse who saw Maria and Jason in the hospital corridor. Another who recognized Edward, the notoriously reclusive widower, holding Maria's hand. A tabloid in turn who overheard the hushed explanations between doctors. By morning, the headlines screamed louder than any human voice. Millionaire fires innocent maid, baby nearly dies. Negligent nanny scandal. Who is the woman who saved his son? Edward Harrington's fatal mistake. Cameras swarmed outside the hospital. Reporters crowded the entrance. Microphones waved like weapons. And Edward knew he had to face them. For Maria, for Jason, for the truth he should have protected from the beginning. The hospital arranged a small podium near the emergency entrance. Edward stepped up, wearing a dark suit still slightly wrinkled from sleepless nights. His hair was combed back, but not perfectly. His eyes were tired but clear. Journalists shouted questions the moment he appeared. "Mr. Harrington, is it true your employee endangered your son? Who is Maria Alvarez? Why is she at the hospital with you? Is this a cover-up?" Edward raised a hand. "I will answer everything." The crowd quieted. He swallowed, glanced to the side, where Maria stood with Jason in her arms, and his expression softened. "My son," Edward began, voice steady but full of emotion, "is alive today because of this woman." Gasps. Cameras clicked furiously. "This woman," he continued, "cared for him when others neglected him. She fed him, comforted him, fought for him. And when his voice faltered, cracking, when I failed to see her value, I made a terrible mistake. I fired her. I believed a lie." He looked directly into the cameras. "And I was wrong." Maria's breath caught. She had never seen a man so powerful, so guarded, stand so vulnerably before the world. Edward continued, turning his words into an oath. "Maria Alvarez is not a criminal, not manipulative, not attention-seeking. She is the only person who showed my son genuine love. She saved his life twice, and I will spend every day making amends for the harm my error caused her." Flash after flash lit the air, capturing the moment a man rebuilt the truth he once destroyed. A reporter shouted, "Are you rehiring her as your maid?" Edward shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "She will never, ever be just a maid in my house again." He turned toward Maria, then, publicly, openly, and extended a hand. "If she agrees, she will return as Jason's primary caregiver, a role she has already proven she's the best person in the world to fill." The cameras went wild. Maria pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. The weight of humiliation she had suffered in silence now dissolved, layer by fragile layer, under the light of Edward's apology. She stepped forward. Their hands met, and the crowd roared. When Edward opened the mansion door for her, Maria paused, not from fear, but from memory. The last time she left these halls, her heart had been shattered. Now she entered again, Not in uniform, not with bowed head, not as a servant, but as someone needed, wanted, trusted. Edward walked beside her, carrying Jason. The baby reached for her the moment they stepped into the living room, whimpering until she took him into her arms. Maria smiled softly, brushing her nose against his cheek. "He missed you," Edward murmured. She looked up. "So did I." Heat rose in his chest. He cleared his throat quickly. "I had the staff prepare a new room for you," he said. "Next to Jason's." "Next to Jason's?" He nodded. "You'll be close if he wakes at night." Maria's heart softened. "Thank you." He hesitated a moment. If you want anything else, just tell me. Nothing is off limits." She opened her mouth to respond, but Jason yawned, a small, soft sound that made both adults smile. Their eyes met. Something warm passed between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. Days passed gently. Nurses visited for checkups. Maria spent mornings feeding Jason, humming lullabies in Spanish. Edward hovered, not intrusively, but protectively, often joining them on the living room couch. He began leaving his office door open. He began watching Maria read bedtime stories to his son. He began listening, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest, to her stories about her childhood, her late infant son, her struggles. And every night, after Jason fell asleep, they sat in the quiet kitchen with steaming chamomile tea. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, more personal. Maria shared her fears of failure, her guilt for not being able to save her own baby, her shock that her body still produced milk, grief clinging physically to her. Edward listened, pained, realizing how blind he had been to her suffering. Then he shared his own, how he blamed himself for his wife's death, how he feared touching Jason because he believed grief lived in his hands, how loneliness had wrapped around him like a second skin. One night, after she confessed she felt unworthy of returning to the mansion, Edward's voice softened. "You are the best thing that has happened to my son," he said. And to this home, Maria's breath hitched. A silence settled between them, warm, not uncomfortable. Edward looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he murmured. "You didn't." Her voice was gentle. When he looked back, she gave a small, shy smile. Something inside him shifted like a door long locked, suddenly opening. Every day, Jason grew stronger. He giggled again. He reached for toys. He smiled whenever Maria walked into the room. When Edward carried him, Jason looked around, searching for her, until she gently touched his back. The doctors called it a miracle. Edward called it something else. "Love," he whispered one afternoon as he watched Maria cradle Jason. "This is what love looks like." Maria glanced up. He shook his head quickly. Nothing. But she had heard, and something fluttered low in her stomach. The mansion no longer felt cold. Edward no longer felt alone. Maria no longer felt invisible. They moved around each other gently, carefully, like two people quietly learning the shape of hope again. A brush of hands when passing the bottle. A soft laugh shared over Jason's new habit of drooling on Edward's expensive suits. A lingering glance in the hallway. A warmth in Edward's chest whenever she smiled. Neither spoke the truth aloud. Not yet, but the air around them had changed. And as Jason slept peacefully in his crib one evening, Maria and Edward found themselves standing side by side in the dim nursery, watching the baby breathe softly. Edward leaned slightly closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his warmth. "He's safe," Maria whispered. "Because of you," Edward replied. She lowered her eyes, shy. He looked at her with something tender, almost reverent, something that could no longer be mistaken for gratitude alone. It was the beginning, quiet, soft, but inevitable. The house was quiet that evening, quiet in a way Edward had never known it to be. Not the hollow, echoing quiet of grief, nor the cold, distant silence of wealth. This was different, softer, like the hush before sunrise. Maria stood near Jason's crib, humming a gentle melody as she folded his tiny blankets. Her touch was careful, almost reverent. Jason, finally free from wires and tubes, slept peacefully, his breathing the steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. Edward stood at the doorway, watching her in the dim glow of the night lamp. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just breathed, slowly, deeply, taking in the sight of the woman who had carried his son back from the edge of death. The woman who had somehow carried him back, too. He hadn't planned on speaking tonight. He didn't know if he even could. His emotions sat heavy and tangled inside his chest, a knot of fear, hope, longing, gratitude. But watching Maria there, calm, gentle, unassuming, something inside him loosened. "Maria," he said softly. She turned quickly, startled. "Sir, Edward, I didn't hear you come in." Her gaze lowered as though she wasn't sure she was allowed to meet his eyes. She had returned to this mansion with quiet steps, always cautious, always unsure whether she truly belonged. Edward walked further into the room, stopping near her, but not too close. "You don't have to call me sir. Not anymore." She swallowed, the movement visible in the soft light. I don't know what to call you." "Edward is fine," he said gently. A faint nod. Awkward, shy, but sincere. He looked at Jason, then back at her. "He's safe because of you. I only did what any—" "No," he interrupted, emotion thickening his voice. "No one else did what you did. No one else could." Maria blinked rapidly, fighting a swirl of feelings. "I didn't save him alone. The doctors, You saved him," Edward insisted. "Twice. Maybe 3 times. And you saved more than just my son." Her brows drew together, confused. He exhaled shakily. He had rehearsed these words in his head, but now that he stood before her, every practiced line evaporated, leaving only raw truth. "You saved me, Maria." She froze, completely still, as if afraid any breath might shatter the moment. Edward stepped closer, voice lowering. "After my wife died, I stopped living. I was only existing, going through motions, breathing but not alive." He looked at his sleeping son, then at the woman beside him. "Then you walked into this house." Maria's eyes shimmered, and she turned her face away. "Edward, please. I don't want to misunderstand anything." "You're not misunderstanding," he said. "Not this time." She held onto the edge of Jason's crib, grounding herself. "There's a world between us. She paused, searching for a word. "You're who you are, and I'm just me." He understood. The class difference. The fear of judgment. Her own scars. Emotional, physical, invisible ones. "Maria," he said gently, "look at me." She hesitated. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze. He reached out, not touching her yet, but offering his hand in the space between them. A silent bridge. "I don't care about class, or status, or what anyone expects of me. I care about my son, and I care about the woman who loved him when I was too lost to see what he needed." Her breath hitched. Edward stepped closer. "I care about the woman who slept hungry so Jason could eat. The woman who sat by his hospital bed for hours. The woman who gave everything even when she had nothing." Tears spilled down Maria's cheeks. "I didn't do those things to be noticed," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's why they matter." She shook her head weakly. I'm afraid, Edward. People like me don't end up with things like this. My whole life, I've only ever been a burden or an afterthought. I don't know how to be anything else." He reached for her hand this time, gently, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. "You're not a burden," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You're the reason my son is alive. You're the reason I'm alive. And I don't want to go another day pretending that what I feel isn't real." Her fingers trembled in his. He moved a little closer, very carefully. "Maria, I'm in love with you." The words hung in the room, warm and trembling like a candle flame. Maria covered her mouth, a quiet sob escaping her. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "Edward, you don't mean that. Not truly. You're grateful, you're emotional, but—" "I know the difference," he said firmly. "Gratitude doesn't feel like this." She closed her eyes, tears slipping through her lashes. "Maria," he whispered, "I am falling in love with you. I think I've been falling for a long time." The room was silent except for Jason's soft breaths. Then she spoke, voice barely audible. "Edward, what if I can't give you what you need? What if I'm too broken? What if I'm never enough for your world?" He shook his head immediately. My world? Maria, you are my world. A sound escaped her, half cry, half disbelief. And I don't want you as my employee, he continued softly. Not ever again. Maria looked up, eyes wide, fragile. I want you as part of our family. She gasped. Her knees wobbled slightly. Edward cupped her cheek with the gentlest touch, wiping her tears with his thumb. Stay with me. Stay with us. Not as Jason's caregiver. Not as someone who works here. But as someone we love. Someone I love. She took a trembling breath. Edward, if I say yes, my whole life changes. And so will mine, he said. And I want that. Her gaze shifted to Jason, who stirred slightly in his sleep as if sensing her presence. His tiny fingers twitched, reaching instinctively toward where Maria stood. She looked back at Edward, at the sincerity in his eyes, at the vulnerability he wore openly for the first time since she had known him. Then she placed her hand over his heart. It was beating fast, strong, alive. Edward, she whispered, I'm scared. I know, he whispered back, pressing his forehead lightly to hers. I am too. A tear slid down her cheek. But I'm willing to try, she breathed. He closed his eyes, relief washing through him like a tide. That's all I ask. Their foreheads rested together in silence. Two wounded souls finding the courage to heal. Jason let out a small sound, and both of them turned toward him. Edward slipped an arm around Maria's waist, gentle, hesitant, but full of meaning, and she didn't pull away. Together, they stepped closer to the crib. Jason opened his eyes, soft and sleepy, and the first thing he reached for was Maria's hand. She smiled through tears, covering his tiny fingers with her own. Edward wrapped his hand over both of theirs, and in that small circle, father, baby, and the woman who had saved them both, a new beginning formed. Not born of perfection, not born of fairy tales, but born of forgiveness, healing, and the kind of love that survives storms. A new family stood there in the dim glow of a nursery. Fragile, flawed, but real, and finally whole. Sometimes the greatest wealth is not measured in money, but in compassion, humility, and love for one another. This story reminds us that true greatness is revealed in how we treat those who serve us when no one is watching. If you enjoyed this story and believe in humility and love, share this story, and subscribe for more uplifting stories that restore faith in the goodness of the human heart.